So I'm guessing looking back now, you'd say that was not good, that it was just stay away from heroin because it takes over. Is that fair to say?
Oh yeah. It's, it's heroin's a scary one because you don't know if you're going to be one of those people who's going to get stuck, who's really going to like it. And if you are one of those people, it's a hard hole to dig yourself out of. Um, and there are people who use heroin or try heroin and never get addicted. They hate it. It's the worst. But it's such a huge gamble to take. There's no, there's no place for that in experimentation, I think.
Okay. So how did heroin start negatively affecting your life day to day? How did it become kind of out of control bad? What happened?
So, it turned from, very quickly, it turned from, you know, smoking it a couple times a day or, a couple times a week, to smoking it every day. And at the beginning, there was never, I don't know why, but I wasn't scared of getting addicted to it because I had thought that, once I took my first hit, I'd be addicted and I'd be stuck and I'd be doing it all day, every day. It wasn't how it turned out. It was a slow build up to eventually realizing too late that I was stuck. So, it made me stop caring about, again, keeping my lungs healthy. So I was back in the hospital a lot. I was missing work, and I was sometimes ditching work to go buy drugs, and any money that I had or could get my hands on or could beg for at a gas station was being spent on drugs, on heroin. So it slowly, took over my finances, and it took over my work life, and it took over my health. And there became a point when I kind of realized that and got scared almost, because I didn't know what to do. I didn't have money. I didn't have anyone to turn to. I didn't know if I wanted to keep going to school. And so I was kind of stuck. Like I hit a wall where I just didn't know what to do next. And at some point, I was talking to someone who knew that I was using heroin and kind of told them what was going on. And they, suggested that maybe I stop, which seems reasonable. But, the thought of stopping didn't cross my mind. It was just, well, how am I going to keep using but continue on with my life was the question in my head. So, yeah, I eventually made a decision that I needed to stop. So I went to an emergency room one night and told him that I had been using heroin and that I would like to be admitted to the hospital so that I could, go through withdrawals and get out of my system and continue on with my life.
Did you have to hit rock bottom before you pursued that?
Rock bottom's a tough term, and I think it gets used in the recovery world. People say that you have to hit rock bottom before you'll ever have a chance of getting sober. But everyone's rock bottom looks different. Some people spend 20 years living on the streets, and that's their rock bottom. Some people have a family member die because of drugs, and that's their bottom. But my life wasn't sustainable, and that's really all I needed to kind of snap out of it and realize that something needed to change. Like, I couldn't keep up the life I was living any longer. So it wasn't that I was homeless. It wasn't that I'd been fired from my job. I was broke, and I wasn't on great terms with my parents. I was on okay terms, but I was sick. My lungs were falling apart. I think I was probably in the 2 months leading up to when I checked myself into that ER. I was hospitalized for lung infections 6 or 8 times for up to sometimes, a week. The longest ones were 2 weeks. So I wasn't doing well, and I wasn't taking care of myself. And I might have, had some serious longer-term consequences had I kept going. But for me, I didn't need that homelessness. I didn't need my catalyst into changing was just that realization that I couldn't sustain it.
So how many months or years ago was that?
So that was, I left Northern California like January of 2014. So about 3.5 years ago, a little over 3.5 years. So that was, January was the first time that I went to that ER, and I told him I was on heroin, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what you did at this point. I didn't know that people go to rehab to deal with this. Like, I knew it in the back of my mind, but I never made the connection that that might have to be what I was going to do. I didn't really realize that this kind of sounds naive saying it out loud, but I didn't realize I'd have to tell my parents that I was using hard drugs. But I was 22. I'm on my parents' health insurance. Of course, they're going to have to know that I'm in a hospital or somewhere trying to seek treatment for drug addiction. Actually, let me rephrase that. They don't have to know, because I'm an adult and I'm 18, and I could have not told them. I could have gotten away with not telling them. But the dynamic with my parents at the time, they knew something was wrong. Me telling them was the next step. If that makes sense.
Totally. So did you move home at that point?
Yeah, so so I went to the ER. I was in the hospital for maybe 3 days, and then I went to a detox facility in Northern California um, for about 3 or 4 more days, just to clean out my system pretty much. Um, and it was basically as bare bones of a rehab detox you could imagine. It was an old, I think it was like a farm that they used to send inmates or prisoners out to like work release kind of thing. So it was a couple of, uh, you know, trailers. One trailer had 20 beds for guys to sleep in. Another trailer had 20 beds for girls to sleep in. And then it was basically sweat it out and let the drug get out of your system kind of facility.
Now I've heard that people can die in that detox process, that it's one of the most painful, terrible things ever, and that it can take a long time. So what I heard you say is that it was just a few days. That it wouldn't be accurate to say that you can detox from heroin in a few days, right?
So there are basically only two major drugs that you could die from the withdrawals alone. One of them being alcohol, and the other one being benzos, like Xanax or Ativan. Those two, since the drugs themselves are depressants, so they suppress your emotions and your body functions, and you know what that is, okay. Yeah, so the opposite happens when you stop taking them. So instead of being slow and lethargic and your kind of nerves and muscles being relaxed, you run the risk of having seizures, which are really, really dangerous if you're not monitored by medical staff. So this particular facility, they required that you be evaluated at an ER first, to make sure that you're not at risk of having seizures at the facility. So that's why I stayed the 3 days in the hospital, or 3-4 days, whatever that was. And they weren't worried about that with heroin, because heroin withdrawals are really, really uncomfortable. And it's basically like the worst flu you ever had for, a week. But they're not going to kill you.
Okay.
And so I mean, it feels awful. It's really, really uncomfortable. But it's basically something you just have to wait out. And there are ways to kind of mitigate the withdrawal effects, but you kind of just have to, it's a time thing. Wait for your system to clean out. And the medicine or the drug doesn't stay in your system that long. 3-4 days, a week tops, and your system's basically cleared it out. It just takes time for all your kind of bodily functions to return back to normal, kind of realize that you're not going to be giving it that drug anymore.
Okay. So, was that the end of your experiences with drugs? I know that sometimes there are certain drugs that they give you to help you with heroin recovery. Do you know about those drugs, and were they a part of your recovery? up to this point?
They were.
What are
So
they
at
called?
this
What are they
first time
called?
around, they were. So there's uh, Suboxone and Subutex or naltrexone are all kind of variants of an opiate blocker is basically what they are. So they prevent you from getting high if you try to use heroin, but they also, some of them have an opiate-like chemical in them that connects to the opiate receptors in your brain. So it doesn't really get you high, but it also helps mitigate the withdrawal symptoms. So if you were to be taking the naltrexone and still try to take heroin or other opiates, your brain would reject it. Nothing would happen. It wouldn't work. So this first time around of treatment for me, I didn't use those because it didn't seem like it was necessary at that point. Later on in my use after another treatment attempt, I did use them. But yeah, that was a couple years later after that first round.
So how long was it before you relapsed after that first attempt at recovery?
So I moved to Southern California and moved and did a 3-week treatment program that was it's called a PHP or partial hospitalization program. What that means is you're basically at the facility from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. all day, then you go home at night and sleep and come back the next day. So I did that for 3 weeks while living at my parents' again. And it was, I think, so after that 3 weeks, I went to a sober living house, a halfway house, whatever the common term is. And it was while I was at that house that I started drinking again. Because in my mind, I had kind of separated out my heroin use from my alcohol use. Like they were, I figured if I was addicted to heroin, I could probably still use alcohol and not have any issues. Which wasn't the case, and I knew it was against the rules to drink in the sober living house, obviously, because that's not sobriety. So that lasted about, I didn't drink the first month there. Sometime during the second month I was there, I believe, I started drinking. And kind of due to the fact that I had to hide it from the people there, and we were breathalyzed every single night. So it was really, it almost, like trying to drink in that environment made me drink in an alcoholic manner. Having to hide it, having to lie about it, having to squirm around breathalyzer tests. And eventually there was a day and I was drinking too much, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to go back to the house that night and pass the breathalyzer. And so I just didn't go back to the house. I called my parents and told them, I'm like, I've been drinking, I'm not sure what to do. And we kind of came to this conclusion, which was probably a bad idea at the time, but I was also starting to get a lung infection again. And they're like, well, would you like to tell your sober house that you've been drinking, or do you want to go to the hospital and deal with this lung infection and not tell them? So, and they left that up to me. You know, maybe I brought up the idea, but I ended up deciding that I wasn't going to tell my sober house that I had been drinking. So I was in the hospital for a week, and got back to the sober house and started drinking again. And a week later, it happened again. And at that point, I was like, yeah, this just isn't going to happen. Like, I can't stay at the sober house. I can't keep doing this. So I crashed in my parents' house and called the house manager the next morning and told him what I did, and went that night to pack up all my stuff, which is real awkward, I gotta say. That's one of the biggest moments of shame I ever felt, probably. Having to walk back into the house with, you know, people you've been living with for 2 months, 3 months, probably 2 months at that point. And kind of this feeling of letting them down and lying to them, and they know that you were lying to them. And so it was, yeah, that was a tough time. And my parents weren't happy, obviously. So they basically said I have 2 days to find another treatment, another rehab to go to, or they would pick one and drop me off. So I ended up going to this other treatment facility in Southern California again. This one was a inpatient treatment, which means everyone was living at the facility 24/7. So it was a little more intense than my first time around. And I really did not want to be there. I wasn't happy that I just wasn't in a good headspace to be dealing with trying to get sober again. Like, I was discouraged and I was annoyed and I felt like I was being forced there. So yeah, it all got off on the wrong foot. And I lasted there about 2 weeks, and I got another lung infection, and I was in the hospital. So I left the treatment facility, went to a hospital for about 2 weeks. And when I went back to the treatment place, I decided that I had stuck my cell phone in, is what I did. And I decided that I was going to find some way to get drugs to the rehab. So I did. And a couple of us at the treatment facility were on board, and we lasted about a day, and the counselor found out and we all got kicked out. So I was going into it with a bad attitude, not wanting to be there, surrounding myself with the other people who didn't want to be there. So it just wasn't promising from the beginning. Like, it was bound to probably not go so well.
So talk to us about, if you were to try your best to summarize sort of how things progressed from that point until now, how would you kind of summarize the path of addiction recovery, relapse for you?
So it was a bumpy road up until about 2 years ago now. I moved to Texas, which is where my parents live. And, there was periods where I was clean for a while. There was periods when I'd use and then get caught. There was one more treatment attempt in there. That was the time around where I tried the naltrexone. Didn't work so well for me. And it kind of all came to a climax in about November of 2015, which was about 2 years after I moved to Texas, and which kind of heroin was in and out of the picture, but alcohol was the big issue. I was drinking, probably the biggest. Yeah, this was about the climax of things. I was drinking every day, all day. I was drinking at work. And my parents pretty much knew that something was going on. They knew that I wasn't my normal self. And I was getting worried about my alcohol use. And so I called a friend of mine who is a nurse and told her kind of my symptoms and that I thought I might be addicted to it, that I would like to stop, and I'm worried about seizures and whatnot. And she said, call your parents or I'm calling them. Like, this isn't worth dying over. And so my parents, I think she actually ended up calling my parents. And I went to treatment for the last time, November of 2015, here in Texas, and has, effective enough that I'm still sober today. So that was the last treatment attempt. Kind of after the mess of the alcohol issue. So from that treatment, I went to another sober living house here in Texas and lived there for about a year, maybe a little over a year, and made some good friends there. And yeah, want me to go into more kind of the recovery details of all that and what led up to sobriety today?
Yeah.
Okay. So the house had the treatment I went to was a really good program, one of the best in the nation. It's typically a month of inpatient and then 3 months of outpatient, which 5 days a week for I think 3 or 4 hours a day. So I did all that, and I was living in a sober living home. So I kind of really just entrenched my whole life in this community of sober people. I had never been a big fan of AA for a number of reasons. But I, attended meetings because that was a requirement of the sober living house I was at. And I got a sponsor and I worked some of the steps. I think the biggest help was surrounding myself with sober people, and people who were like-minded and who knew what I went through, and a very non-judgmental crowd in general. Because they've all been there, and they know what it's like. And to the Mormon world, my behavior seems extreme, but to the AA world, to the recovery world, I'm pretty average. So it's nice to not be, I'm not the outsider, I'm not the outcast, I'm not the it was a group to identify with. And yeah. Yeah.
So for you, AA, are you saying AA was helpful?
I'm not saying that AA was helpful, but living at a sober living home in general with just a bunch of sober people all around was helpful.
Okay.
I'm not a huge fan of the 12 steps, the AA program, just because of their heavy reliance on God and prayer. And it just didn't work for me. Especially coming out of a time when I was trying to avoid anything religious. I didn't want to jump back into relying on a higher power to save me from my addiction. And it works for a lot of people. It just didn't jive with my head at the time. And there are a lot of people in recovery who don't believe in God, and they have dedicated groups for atheists or agnostic. So people make it work. Just wasn't for me, I guess.
Sure. So being in this recovery house was a real important key to your recovery.
Yeah, I think it was. Having friends and like getting out of my own head and getting out of my own isolation, and not having to hide, my past from people, makes life so much easier. It'll just eliminate so much stress, and you have a group of people who are there to help you when you're down, and you're there to help people when they're down. And that's what kind of the basis of AA was from the beginning. It was started as a group of people helping other people to stay sober and have people who you're accountable to, and have people you could be honest with. And some people find that within AA meetings. For me, I found that within my sober living house.
Got it. And so when did you leave that?
So there were some management changes, probably end of 2016 at that sober house. And the new owners were pretty much using it to make money off the people who were living there. So it got to be not the best environment for me to be in. So I left January of this year, beginning of this year. And I'm now back at my parents' house for the time being.
And I'm guessing that relapse is common. You've done some treatment and recovery. How do you, well, first of all, you've kind of explained to us what made the difference with this most recent treatment that you received.
Mm-hmm.
How do you even assess your own future as it relates to recovery or relapse, or can you?
For me, it hasn't been an easy road, and it's been a bumpy road, and relapse, like you said, is common among a lot of people, but it's hard to think of where my future might be in terms of recovery in 5 years. Of course, I hope that I'm not addicted to heroin again. That's the ideal. But I know that relapse is so common among people that if it were to happen, I don't know. I mean, I'm doing whatever I can now, the best I can, to not make that happen. I think for a lot of people, they need to realize that, for everyone, one slip up isn't the end of the road. And the AA program likes to paint that, one slip up, or if you have a binge on something, that you failed and that you're back to square one and you have to start over. And I think that can be discouraging to a lot of people, because the accidents are going to happen and slip-ups are going to happen, but it's about what you do on the tail end of that really matters. So, of course, hoping that I'm not going to relapse. And of course, if I have kids or a family one day, I wouldn't, promote drug use, but I also wouldn't make it as big of a taboo as it was in my early life. I think the all or nothing, the black and white view of drugs that is kind of presented somewhat by the church, but also by, the DARE programs and the government and things of that nature, are more harmful than good in terms of kind of realistic education about drugs. So I think having an honest education is, figure out as much as you can about things without glorifying it, which is, tough to do, because it's hard to tell kids, hey, don't smoke weed when you're a kid, because it might be bad for you, or it might be addicting, or don't do this drug or that drug, without them knowing like the science behind what addiction is and what the actual drugs do, and knowing that it's not the end of the world if someone makes a mistake, if that makes sense.
Sure. It does. This is probably an impossible question to answer, but if someone were to say to you, if you could go back to your Orthodox Mormon days before you ever tried drugs and just live the word of wisdom and remained kind of faithful to the church versus what you've been through now, do you even feel like you can answer that with any meaningful response either way?
My answer would be that if I had the choice, I wouldn't go back. I am happy with who I am today. And I know that my Mormon upbringing and my experiences in life and my relationships with people and my breakups and my drug use and even all the negative things that happened in my life make me who I am today. And I'm happy with who I am today, so I wouldn't want to change that. I wouldn't want to, I'm so happy with what I know today and like kind of where I am, at least mentally, that I wouldn't trade my experience for, I guess, kind of the ease of being a young Orthodox Mormon. Life is hard and life is sad and life is challenging, but that's the point. I'm so much a better person today than I was when I was a child. From a Mormon view, I've tried to look at my life today as if I were still Mormon and what I thought about someone who did drugs while I was a kid. Does that make sense? Like me trying to look at myself from my younger self. And my life may seem like it was a mess for a long time and that I was out of control, which I was, and it was a mess, but it was my mess and we learned from our messes. And I'd rather make a mistake and learn more than never make a mistake and not learn. So building up experiences in my life, positive and negative, build our personalities and build our view of the world and build our view of other people. And as long as we're progressing in a direction that we want to progress, which I'd say I am at this point, then we should be okay with ourselves. And I think that was a hard thing for me to learn, to realize that my mistakes and my accomplishments are part of what make me who I am today. And there's no reason to be ashamed of that. There's no reason to hide that from people, as hard as it may be sometimes.
Where do you stand today, church-wise? To whatever you're comfortable sharing. Whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah. Church isn't for me. It doesn't work with my life, and it doesn't work with the way I think. My parents and my little sister are still very active and believing. And I think that's awesome. It works for them, and I'm happy. My little sister just got back from a mission, and she loved it. And I ended up, probably the first time I've been to church in a long time, when she got back and gave her homecoming talk and sacrament meeting. I got to go see that, and it was cool. And I like being able to support my family and the things that they do. I see no reason to talk down or think bad of them because they believe something different. It works for some people and it doesn't work for other people, and it just doesn't work for me.
Do you miss the church in your life at all? Are there things you miss about it? Growing up, in high school, the majority of my close group of friends were not Mormon. I had my non-Mormon friends and I had my Mormon friends. And my closest friends were the non-Mormons. So I never really lost a whole lot of kind of the close social connections. We were good friends, and it was nice to have that at church.
Um, and I mean, the scouting program was fun, and going to EFY was a blast. And but those aren't experiences that, in my mind, can't be replicated outside of the church. So if I wanted to go on a camp out with friends, I could go on a camp out with friends, and it's great. If I need, so yeah, I just don't see in my life any aspects that can't be replicated, if that makes sense.
What about this idea that if you believe really hard in the church again and really obey the commandments and follow, you won't fall off the straight and narrow. You won't relapse because you're holding on to like something that's true and sure and solid and that has really high standards. Have you ever just been, man, life's been so hard. I just want a path that I can close my eyes and follow and hold on to the iron rod and it'll keep me safe. Has that ever even been tempting?
I mean, it was so comforting to be a youth in the church and have that framework for my life and to have answers to my questions and to know what to do if I made a mistake. Having that guidebook on life is having it and then not having it is really, really difficult. So, there came that point basically after BYU where that framework to my life got lost. We talked about this, and I kind of struggled to find something else to fill that void. So I think it's important for me now. I'm still struggling to find, I guess, my direction in life. I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it, but putting together a plan for my future, something that's really difficult for me because I just don't have a super solid framework for, I guess, what I want out of life. I had 18 years with the church framework of what I want out of life, and now I'm 25? Yeah, I'm 25. I'm still trying to figure out how to create structure in my life. And I think having that structure is really important for me to not fall back into the isolation and fall back into, depression or anxiety issues. And to have that purpose and to have that goal and to have focus in life.
So that's another
build that back up. Yeah.
That's another argument for returning to church and even returning to orthodoxy. It gives you an identity, a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning. You know what you want and need. You know what your life's supposed to be about. You're supposed to get married, have kids, get a good job, serve in the church. Does that ever make you want to go back? Because it's kind of a path that works for a lot of people, that really plugs all those holes that you're saying you're still trying to figure out how to fill.
I mean, it sounds nice on the surface, but I don't know. Okay, we'll see if this analogy makes sense. Once you know how a magician does a trick, it's hard to unsee how the trick is done. So kind of going my kind of post-Mormon life compared to my Mormon life, it's hard, if not near impossible, for me to, knowing what I know now, to go back to that mindset. Because my view on life is worlds away from what Mormon view on life is. I wouldn't consider myself an atheist, but I also wouldn't say that I believe in the Christian God. So I don't know, it sounds nice on the surface, but I just don't think I could ever feel right about it, living my life that way.
Kind of once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't get it back in. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And even if you could, I guess I've already asked you this, but I'll ask you one more time. If you could, would you want to? I think you've already told me no, you wouldn't.
Yeah, even if, yeah, I wouldn't undo what I've done.
Yeah.
I try not to live my life with regrets.
Okay. So just to kind of close, I first want to thank you so much for your candor and your honesty and your willingness to share. I'm going to just ask you give you a couple audiences and let you say something to each audience, just to kind of summarize. For anyone who's considering drug use before they've sort of even started marijuana or alcohol or any of that sort of stuff, there's a lot of post-Mormons out there or liberal or questioning or transitioning Mormons that are like, okay, I don't believe in the word of wisdom necessarily anymore. And there's a big, beautiful world out there of things to try. What advice or thoughts would you give to them as a beginning group?
If you're not in a stable place mentally or emotionally, then it's not worth, it can either add fuel to the fire in a positive light or a negative light. And if you're in a bad place, then it might exacerbate the bad. So it's a risk, and it's something you got to weigh against how you foresee your life. But I mean, educate yourself on drugs and addiction as much as you can from varieties of sources, because you never know where you might end up if you slip down the wrong path.
Would you be able to say just stay away forever? It's too dangerous. Or if not, what keeps you from being able to say that?
I think saying that would be similar to the just say no, war on drugs view, the church view. And I think it's really unhealthy and unrealistic for most people. I tried the just say no approach, and look where we are today. So I think again, it goes back to education. Like, know what you're getting into and don't be ashamed if you realize you're falling down the wrong slope. Because there's always people to help. There's always someone who's going to know more than you about something.
That was my next question. For someone who's fallen in, how do you get out before it's too late?
So, realizing that there are options out there, that, if you're over 18 and you could tell your doctor in confidence and they aren't allowed to tell your parents. So if you're ashamed or scared of telling parents that you've been using drugs, that you've been experimenting with marijuana or something, going to a doctor or a therapist are people who are legally obligated to keep confidence. So just realizing that there are resources out there and that people are out there to help. Telling my parents was really, really hard at first. But if I hadn't done it, if I tried to go down the path by myself, I don't know. So there's options. I guess that's the answer, is that there's always someone who could help you.
So reach out to a professional or a close loved one.
Yeah.
Even if you're sad or embarrassed or scared.
Yeah. It's so much better to be embarrassed about telling someone you've been using drugs than for you to die as a result of using them, and being too ashamed to admit it. It's not worth your life.
If you know someone who is addicted to drugs or alcohol, how in the world can you help versus just stand by and watch them suffer or perish, without feeling helpless, basically? How can we help our loved ones who are? How do we identify it, and then how do we help?
So the first one, how to identify it, is probably the hardest question out there. It took me a while before I could even identify myself that I was using, like, in an addictive manner. So it's really case by case. I mean, there are some things that are pretty much beyond a doubt they have a problem, but there's kind of a line in the middle of the playing field where.
Well, what are those? What are the beyond the doubt symptoms?
IV drug use is never going to end well. Okay, I won't say never. It's probably not going to end well. If someone if a loved one's stealing money from you, or if a loved one is pawning everything they own, if they're non-functional, if they're sick, a lot of people could kind of look at someone who's on heroin or meth and realize, yeah, they look like they have a problem. But yeah, the behavior is so varying among everyone. I think a lot of it starts with having an open relationship with your loved ones to begin with, and having a forum where you can have an honest dialogue with, if it's your close friends or if it's your family members. So starting with that, I think, is really important. It just helps get rid of any of that worry of being ashamed to go tell someone. What was the second part of your question?
I guess it was just, how do you recognize someone struggling, and then how do you help them versus stand by helpless?
It's just, pushing someone into treatment or forcing them to stop when they're not at a stable place might not end well. My second treatment I was kind of forced into, and it didn't end well. So showing the love to the people you care about who might have a problem is probably going to do more than a forced intervention, in my opinion.
And that love would look like what? That type of love would look like what?
You know, doing what you can to not enable their behavior, but also let them know that see, it's another really hard line where you're trying to help a loved one while also not, providing too big of a safety net for them, where there's nothing for them to lose if they continue to keep using drugs. I don't know.
What does enabling look like? Tell us what enabling looks like.
So, I mean, it could be anywhere from knowing someone is using drugs and not saying something to financially supporting their habit, which I've seen in some cases. So allowing them to continue to get away with bad behavior while someone's life is falling apart, if they're losing their job, or if they're sick and in the hospital, if they're dying, and not letting them know that you're there to help them. I don't know. Like me and my parents kind of struggled finding that line for a while between them providing too much of a safety net and them kicking me out when I relapsed. But there needs to be boundaries, and there needs to be clearly defined boundaries. And I think that's another place where a professional needs to get involved, I think.
Okay, that makes sense. What do you feel and think about your future? And what would you say to give hope to others who are struggling or, trying to heal and recover and move on? Talk about your future and give hope to others who are in this situation now or who will be.
I have a positive view of my future. It used to be that all I saw was, addiction and loneliness, but that faded away. So, I don't look at the rest of my life as a countdown to death. I'm not kind of just. I try to do my best to not, kind of let my life waste away as much as possible, which I kind of fell into for a while. So, realizing that you're not alone, and that, everyone has someone who loves them. And that's something that is hard to remember at times. But, losing your life over drugs is never is never, it's just not something that needs to happen. And it's all too common kind of in the news today. It's opiate addiction is on the rise, and it's scary. And there are a lot of people who know people or are addicted and don't know what to do, or don't know that their use might turn into addiction someday. So yeah, what was the second part again?
Just, I guess, what do you see for your future?
Yeah, so I mean, I haven't finished school. I put that on hold to deal with all the addiction stuff. It's something that is going to, need to happen in the near future. I've never really seen myself as someone who would have kids. I don't know why. I just never seemed like a part of my mentality for some reason. But yeah, I mean, just living my life without regrets and living my life in a way that I could go to bed at night knowing that I'm happy with the choices I made and that I'm not having to remember the lies I told. It's so much easier to, not have to deal with webs of lies and dishonesty. And, but so I'm not worried about my future. I'm not worried about future relationships. And whatever happens, happens. And I'm kind of okay with wherever my life, ends up. So I try to take each day with, pretty lighthearted approach to things. I don't dwell on my mistakes, and I don't obsess about the future. And I think, I'm happy, and I'm happy with being happy, and I'm okay with that.
Well, I love it. Well, Graham, I know that this is a really, really big problem. One last thing. Do you have any comments about the pharmaceutical industry and the availability of opiates, and to what extent both big pharma and physicians are complicit in this what some describe as an epidemic?
So there's a lot of issues kind of surrounding doctors and, pharmaceutical manufacturers. I think a lot of doctors don't have the proper training about how to prescribe medicine, opiates and pain medicine for people who are in need of, actual pain management, cancer patients or, surgery, or it's hard. It's a hard thing to regulate because on one hand, you don't want to be, prescribing medication to an addict, but you also don't want to be taking away life-saving medicine from people who need it. And I think, there are a lot of doctors who are, maybe not a lot, but there are doctors out there who are taking advantage of the fact that opiates and other medications are really addictive and making tons of money off of the addictions of others. But I don't know how one might properly regulate doctors writing prescriptions, because it's so between one person and the next. What makes one person an addict may not make the next person an addict. Everything is such a case-by-case basis that it's hard to legislate, I think, things like opiate prescriptions or Xanax, benzo prescriptions. But clearly there's an issue somewhere. I mean, opiate overdoses have been on the rise in the past, a lot in the past 2 years, but really in the past 5 or 6 years, I think. So I think a lot of that has to do with probably failed drug education and the failed drug treatment programs, and a kind of a society that shames and incarcerates and criminalizes addicts instead of treating them for their addiction. So a lot of it stems back to the war on drugs, I think. That was that Reagan administration.
Yep.
If I'm not mistaken, wasn't he the just say no? Okay.
Mostly.
And he was pushing for a drug-free society, and that's not going to happen. And sending non-violent criminals to jail is not going to help most people. So it's going to start from the bottom. It's going to start from re-educating people, and it's going to start by being honest about the effects of drugs, and offering treatment options instead of jail and prison time. So there's a big overhaul that needs to be done, I think. And it's not going to be easy. And it's not going to be quick.
Got it. All right. Well, Graham, it's so courageous, as far as I'm concerned, for you to be willing to come publicly, talk about your story, talk about how kind of it happened to you, and most importantly, to talk about how you got better and to encourage others. So thank you so much for being willing to share your story. Any final words of wisdom or hope you want to share with the audience?
I think that about wraps it up. Thanks for having me. It's been fun. I've enjoyed this. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much, Graham. It's been great to have you. Thanks to all who tuned in live and who have been listening. We really appreciate it when people have questions and comments and support. It means the world. I want to thank everyone who supports Mormon Stories podcast. You can find us at mormonstories.org. Please post comments or questions or feedback there. I want to thank everyone who donates to support Mormon Stories to make it possible. Your donations are what keep us alive. We're transparent with our finances. We're a 501c3, which means your donations are tax deductible. So please consider supporting us if you can, and we'll do this as long as you're able to support us. But thanks again for everyone tuning in. If you have a story about addiction and recovery that you think adds to the two stories we've already told, please feel free to reach out at mormonstories@gmail.com. We would love to help you tell your story. And most importantly, we're just looking to help people find health and healing and joy in or outside of Mormonism. That's what we're about. So thanks again for everyone tuning in live. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Mormon Stories. And we'll see you all again soon here on Mormon Stories podcast. Take care, Graham. Thanks again.
Thanks, John. Have a good one.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.